All our lives we've been lied to about the 19th century. Do you really believe that in an era when the main transport was the horse and electricity was considered a carnival trick, humanity suddenly gained the ability to move mountains? We look at black and white photographs and obediently nod, accepting the official version of history. But one only needs to turn on critical thinking for a second. One only needs to pick up a calculator, and the entire house of cards of academic science begins to crumble. Today we will dissect one of the most grandiose deceptions in human history. The discussion will be about an object that changed the geopolitical map of the world and became the cause of endless wars and financial machinations: the Suez Canal. We are told that it was dug by Egyptian peasants with hoes and woven baskets. We are told that this is a triumph of French engineering thought of the mid-19th century. But I will tell you something that will make your hair stand on end. The Suez Canal was not built. It was simply dug up. Let's cast aside school textbooks and look at the bare facts. The official start date for the works is 1859. Completion is 1869. 10 years. The canal's length is 160 kilometers. Its width at the water's surface is up to 350 meters, and its depth is 20 meters. Can you even imagine this volume? Official sources contradict each other, but even by the most modest estimates, the volume of excavated soil amounted to 75 million cubic meters of sand and stone. 75 million. Try to comprehend this figure. If this sand were loaded into standard railway cars, the train would circle the globe along the equator several times. And we are asked to believe that all this was done manually, without heavy machinery, without conveyors, in the conditions of an absolute desert, where there is no water, no food, no shelter from the scorching sun. Historians claim that 1.5 million people worked on the construction. 1.5 million fellahs who were driven there by force. Okay, let's assume that. But where are the traces of their presence? Where are the barracks for 1.5 million people? Where are the mountains of garbage, pottery, remains of tools? Any construction site, even the most primitive, leaves behind a cultural layer. Here, however, there is sterile cleanliness. But the most terrible thing is not even that. The most terrible thing is logistics. A person needs a minimum of 3 liters of water per day just not to perish in the desert during heavy physical labor. Multiply 1.5 million by 3. That's 4.5 million liters of fresh water daily. Every single day, for 10 years. How was this water delivered? By camels?
In water skins?
The nearest source of fresh water is the Nile, but it is hundreds of kilometers away. We are told that a special freshwater canal, the Ismailia Canal, was dug for this purpose. But here's the problem. Its digging was only completed by 1863. And how did they live and work for the first 4 years? Did they drink sand? Let's look at photographs from that era. This is, perhaps, the strongest proof of the lie. During the canal's construction era, photography was already developed enough to capture the process. And what do we see in the pictures? We see a long, perfectly smooth expanse of water. We see ships calmly moving through the canal. But we practically do not see the process of the grandiose construction itself. Where are these anthills of people? Where are the thousands of carts? In the rare footage presented to us as construction, we see a few dozen people lazily picking at sand against the backdrop of an already completed gigantic channel.
They look not like builders creating a megalithic structure, but like archaeologists clearing drifts.
They look bewildered against the backdrop of the grandeur attributed to them. Pay attention to the banks. When you dig a ditch, where do you put the earth? Right, you throw it onto the bank, forming an embankment. But in the photographs of the Suez Canal, the banks are flat. There are no spoil heaps corresponding to 75 million cubic meters. Where did the sand go? Did it evaporate? Or did someone carefully remove it? But where? And by what means? The official version states that the soil was transported by camels and donkeys. Are you serious? Imagine a caravan capable of transporting 75 million cubic meters. This is mathematical absurdity. Even if every inhabitant of Egypt at that time, including infants and the elderly, took a basket in hand, they would not have managed such a volume in 10 years. It is physically impossible. Moreover, the bottom of the canal in places consists not just of sand, but of hard limestone rock. These had to be chiseled out. With what? Pickaxes? Dynamite was not yet used so skillfully on an industrial scale then, and there are no traces of blasting work in old photos. The canal walls are perfectly smooth, as if cut by a giant laser or a milling machine, a technology we don't even possess today. And here we come to the main question that historians diligently avoid. Who actually designed this marvel? Ferdinand de Lesseps? A French diplomat who had no engineering education whatsoever? We are told that he simply possessed the gift of persuasion and managed to raise money. But who did the calculations? Where are the blueprints? Where are the complex hydraulic schemes for locks and level differences? They are absent, or they are not shown to us. It gives the impression that de Lesseps and his team arrived at an already prepared site. They knew where to dig. More precisely, they knew where they simply needed to remove wind-blown sand, to uncover an ancient artery created by a civilization superior to us in its level of development. Look at old maps. On maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, long before the official construction, a strait is already marked in this location. Sometimes it is intermittent, sometimes full of water. Past cartographers were not idiots. They drew what they saw. The canal existed. It was covered with sand during an unknown global catastrophe, the very event that buried the first floors of buildings worldwide with clay and silt, the event that wiped the cities of Tartary off the face of the earth. The Suez Canal is not a 19th century new build. It is a legacy of an antediluvian world that the new masters of life simply appropriated, inventing a fairy tale about millions of peasants with baskets. But if this is true, an even more frightening question arises. Why was this mystification necessary? Why couldn't the truth be told? We found an ancient canal and restored it. Because that would destroy the entire chronology. It would show that before us, people lived here who possessed technologies allowing them to change the planet's landscape at will. It would make people ask questions. Where did this civilization go? And are we not facing the same fate? Let's put emotions aside and turn to dry engineering logic, which, as is known, does not tolerate falsehood. The official history tries to convince us that most of the work was performed by Egyptian peasants with woven baskets. Imagine the physics of this process. You are standing knee-deep in liquid mud or hot sand. You fill a basket that weighs about 20 kilograms. You lift it onto your shoulder and walk up a loose slope to the height of a 5-story building to empty its contents. And so, thousands of times a day. But any engineer will tell you that dry sand crumbles at a 30-degree angle. It is impossible to dig a 20-meter deep trench in sand with vertical edges without reinforcing the walls. The sand will simply flow back, no matter how much you scoop it out. This is a Sisyphean task. For the canal to hold its shape, the banks must be reinforced with concrete or stone, or a complex sheet piling method must be used, which simply did not exist on such a scale in the mid-19th century. However, if we look at early photographs or lithographs, we see perfectly smooth banks, as if cut with a knife. No landslides, no crumbling rock. This contradicts the laws of physics of granular materials, unless it's not just sand. What if the builders weren't digging, but clearing an already existing channel, the walls of which were vitrified or strengthened by an ancient technology unknown to us? There is a theory that the canal bed was laid thousands of years ago, using technologies that transformed the soil into a monolith. This is why the banks have stood for centuries and do not require major repairs, which would be inevitable for a simple earthen ditch. Official sources claim that in the later stages of construction, the French brought miracle machines, steam dredgers and excavators. We are shown engravings depicting these monsters, long chutes through which soil was supposedly transported. But let's look at the technical characteristics of steam engines from the 1860s. The efficiency of such installations was negligible. They required a monstrous amount of coal and fresh water for their boilers. Where are the coal depots? Where are the water tanks for the machines? In the photographs, we see a desert. No infrastructure to service an armada of machinery. Moreover, the productivity of these mechanical dinosaurs, even according to the most optimistic paper reports of the Suez Canal Company, could not have ensured the pace of work, which suddenly accelerated in the last 2 years before the opening. Statistics show a strange anomaly. For the first 7 years, work practically stood still, and then, as if by magic, in 3 years, a volume was completed that would have required decades. Historians explain this by the introduction of machinery, but mathematics says the opposite. To excavate the remaining millions of cubic meters of soil in such a short period, these steam excavators would have had to work at the speed of modern atomic combines, without breaking down or stopping for a second. This is technically impossible for the 19th century. It's like claiming that a carriage can break the sound barrier if you whip the horses hard enough. This means the scope of work was fictitious. The canal was already there. It just needed to be filled with water. And then another fact emerges that is carefully suppressed: the geology of the isthmus. We are told about sand, but geological maps show that the canal's path encounters rocky ridges of limestone and gypsum, especially in the area of the El Gisser threshold and Serapeum. Have you tried digging limestone rock with a hoe? Or even with an early excavator's bucket? It's monolithic rock. Blasting work is needed to pass through it. Where are the records of purchasing hundreds of tons of explosives? Where are the mentions of thousands of sappers? They are absent. There are only vague mentions of manual excavation. To manually excavate a passage through rock 100 meters wide and 20 meters deep? This is work for a civilization of giants, not for exhausted fellas. If you look at satellite images of these sections today, you can see that the cut in the rock bears traces of machine processing, but not chaotic, like from explosions, but smooth, as if the rock was cut like butter. There is another point that shatters the official version: the so-called bitter lakes. They are part of the canal. We are told that these were dry salt depressions that were filled with water. But the hydrology of these lakes indicates that they were always part of a single water system connecting the seas. The bottom of these lakes has a complex relief, resembling artificial fairways. Who laid them out, and when? Did nature accidentally create a perfect navigable channel of the required depth at the bottom of a dried-up lake? This is absurd. We are faced with the fact that the entire Suez Canal project is not construction, but restoration. It is a global archaeological operation, disguised as an engineering feat of the century. De Lesseps was not a brilliant engineer. He was a keeper of a secret. He was given maps. Maps of a world that existed before the catastrophe. Recall how the world suddenly became obsessed with Egyptology in the 19th century. Napoleon dragged a whole army of scientists and artists to Egypt. Why? Not just for the pyramids, which one can simply look at. They were looking for something specific. They were looking for communications. Old transport arteries that could be reactivated to gain control over world trade. Suez is the key. He who controls the passage from Europe to Asia controls the world. And to appropriate this key, it was necessary to erase the memory of its true creators. It was necessary to convince humanity that before the 19th century, there was only a wild desert and nomads here. But the artifacts scream otherwise. Workers constantly stumbled upon strange finds.
In the engineers' reports, there are fleeting mentions of ancient cemeteries, remains of walls, and pottery found dozens of meters deep under the sand. How did pottery end up 20 meters deep? This is only possible in one case. If this layer of soil was deposited instantly as a result of a giant flood of water and mud. We return again to the theme of the flood, the clay cataclysm that reshaped the planet's surface quite recently. The Suez Isthmus is a crime scene where the evidence is in plain sight. Official science calls this a cultural layer. But a cultural layer grows millimeters per year. It doesn't bury cities and canals under meters of clay. What was unearthed under the guise of a canal is part of an antediluvian infrastructure. Perhaps the very same unified global system that included star forts and underground tunnels piercing continents. If the technical aspect of the issue raises doubts, then the financial and demographic history of the Suez Canal's construction is not just inconsistencies, it's an outright confession. As they say, follow the money and you'll find the truth. We are told a touching story of public subscription, of how simple French rentiers brought their savings to support a great dream. But let's look at the figures. The company's initial capital was 200 million francs, a gigantic sum for that time. But by the time the works were completed, expenses exceeded this sum more than twofold, reaching almost 500 million francs. Where did this difference come from? Egypt, being formally part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, was literally plundered. The ruler of Egypt, Said Pasha, and then his successor, Ismail Pasha, were forced not only to provide free labor, but also to finance most of the project, incurring monstrous debts to European banks. This was the first operation in recent history for the global enslavement of an entire state through an infrastructure project. But the most interesting thing here is the behavior of Great Britain. Throughout the first phase of construction, London was categorically against the canal. British engineers, including the famous Robert Stephenson, publicly stated that the project was technically unfeasible due to the difference in sea levels and constant sand drifts. They called it a scam. Prime Minister Palmerston did everything to disrupt the work. And then something inexplicable happens. In 1875, just 6 years after its opening, Great Britain suddenly bought the controlling stake in the canal from the bankrupt Egyptian ruler. The deal was done lightning fast. The money, £4 million sterling, was provided by the Rothschild banking house. Why buy a technically unfeasible scam for such money? The answer is simple. British intelligence realized that the French were not building, but unearthing. When it became clear that the ancient artery actually existed and functioned, Britain could not allow rivals to control the planet's main gateway. They bought not shares, they bought access to old world technologies. Now let's return to the people. Demography is a precise science, and it leaves no stone unturned in the myth of 1.5 million workers.
The population of all Egypt in the mid-19th century was, by various estimates, between 4 and 5 million people, including women, the elderly, and children. If you take 1.5 million able-bodied men for the construction of the century, who remains in the fields? Who grows the bread? Who feeds the country? With such an extraction of labor force, total famine should have begun in Egypt, which would have decimated the population.
But the chronicles of that time do not record mass extinction from hunger in those years. This means that these 1.5 million workers simply weren't there. This figure is a fiction, invented to write off colossal budgets and justify the 10-year period of construction, which in reality was an operation of clearing and demining. And here we come to the grim topic of casualties. Official history modestly reports that about 120,000 people died during construction. The main cause is cholera and dysentery. 120,000 corpses. Where are their graves? Such a gigantic cemetery cannot be hidden. It should have been found by archaeologists. It should have been stumbled upon during the canal's expansion in the 20th century. But no mass graves of canal builders have been found. Where did the bodies go? Or, perhaps, they never existed at all? And the casualty figure was thrown in to explain why none of the builders returned home and told the truth about what they saw there. And what they saw, most likely, was not sand, but the ruins of majestic structures that protruded from the ground. There is another, more terrifying theory. What if the epidemics did occur, but not of cholera? What if, during the excavation of the ancient channel, the workers breached sealed volumes or stumbled upon the remains of weapons from the war that destroyed the previous civilization? Strange diseases, mowing down people by the thousands, could have been the result of radiation sickness or poisoning by unknown chemicals preserved in the lower layers of the soil. This would explain why construction was so often halted and why outsiders were so reluctantly allowed to observe until the very end. The canal zone was a quarantine zone. The apotheosis of this spectacle was the opening of the canal in November 1869. It was not just a celebration, it was a bacchanal of victors. The European elite celebrated the appropriation of the god's legacy. The opera, Aida, which Giuseppe Verdi supposedly wrote for this event, is actually full of hidden meanings about the demise of ancient Egypt and the departure of old gods. A flotilla of dozens of ships passed through the canal so smoothly as if they had been sailing there for centuries. No hitches, no groundings, which would have been inevitable for a newly dug, untested fairway. The depths were known in advance. The captains had maps in their hands even before the first excavator touched the ground. The Suez Canal became an instrument for reformatting the world. It destroyed old trade routes, ruined thousands of merchants who transported goods around Africa or overland through Russia. It was a blow to the economy of the Russian Empire and Great Tartary, whose remnants were still resisting the New World Order. The canal cut off the east from the west, turning Africa into an island that could be easily circumnavigated. It was a geopolitical cut with a scalpel. But most importantly, it became proof that history has been rewritten. For if one admits that the canal was always there, one must also admit that before us, a global transport network existed on Earth, uniting continents. Who were these builders of the past, capable of cutting continents like pie? And why do we find traces of their activities not only in Egypt, but also in Panama, and in Corinth, and in China? Everywhere the same impossible volumes of earth, everywhere the absence of machinery, and everywhere murky stories about thousands of deceased workers. This is the handwriting of the same force that cleanses the planet after a catastrophe,
appropriating the surviving crumbs of grandeur. The Suez Canal is not an isolated case, and not a lucky break for French adventurers. If you think this is the only impossible construction of that time, you are deeply mistaken. One only needs to lift one's head a little and look at the globe, and a frightening pattern will reveal itself. As if on command, in the second half of the 19th century, a feverish construction of gigantic hydraulic engineering structures began all over the world. The Panama Canal, the Corinth Canal, the reconstruction of the Grand Canal of China, large-scale works on waterways in North America and Russia. Everywhere the same scenario. People with shovels arrive, scratch at the earth, and then we are presented with cyclopean cuts in mountains and perfectly straight channels thousands of kilometers long. And everywhere the same oddities appear. The absence of heavy machinery in photos, colossal mortality, and a discrepancy between the volume of excavated soil and the time frames. Look at the Corinth Canal in Greece. Its walls are sheer cliffs almost 80 meters high. We are told that it began to be chiseled out as early as Emperor Nero, and was completed in the 19th century. Look at the photographs of this canyon. Do you really believe that these perfectly vertical walls in solid rock were carved with chisels? This is machine cutting, and cutting with a tool that does not chip the stone, but removes it in layers or vaporizes it. And again, the same story. The canal was simply finished digging. It was already there, like a giant crack connecting two seas. But who could have created such a crack artificially? Only a civilization for whom stone was as malleable a material as plasticine is for us. And the Panama Canal? And again, our old acquaintance Ferdinand de Lesseps, the very one who supposedly built Suez. He arrives in Panama with the same blueprints and tries to repeat the trick. But there, things did not go according to plan. Why? Officially, due to malaria and financial machinations. But there is a version that in Panama, the destruction of the ancient channel was far more serious than in Egypt. There, it required not just clearing sand, but restoring locks destroyed by tectonic shifts. The French simply did not understand what they were up against, and their primitive technologies proved powerless against the ruins of a megalithic system. Later, the Americans simply blew everything up with dynamite and poured concrete, forever burying under it the remains of ancient mechanisms that, perhaps, controlled the water level between the oceans. All this suggests that the Suez Canal is not just a transport artery for ships. It is an element of a planetary energy system. Think about it. The canal connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. These are two giant reservoirs with different salinities, different temperatures, and different water densities. When you connect them with a direct channel, a powerful flow of ionic exchange arises. This is a giant battery. The hydrodynamics of the canal is such that it creates a constant current without any pumps. Is it possible that ancient builders used this potential difference to generate energy? Energy that powered not light bulbs, but the very biosphere of the region. There is a hypothesis that the system of canals around the world served for terraforming. These water arteries were the planet's circulatory system, regulating the climate. Recall that the Sahara was not always a desert. Old maps show flourishing cities and full-flowing rivers there. What if the silting of the Suez Canal with sand was the reason for the desiccation of North Africa? Water stopped circulating, energy exchange was disrupted, and a flourishing land turned into a dead wasteland. And when the canal was dug up in the 19th century, it was an attempt by the new masters to start the old machine. But they used it primitively, only as a road for their steamboats.
not understanding the true purpose of this complex device. We behave like savages who found a smartphone and use it to crack nuts. This realization is unsettling. We live on the ruins of a world that was orders of magnitude more complex and harmonious than ours. We are proud of our skyscrapers and iPhones, but we cannot even replicate the stone masonry of the embankments of St. Petersburg or Kronstadt without using polymers and reinforcement. We are a parasitic civilization that has settled in the empty house of giants. We use their roads, their foundations, their canals, but attribute these achievements to ourselves, inventing fairy tales about the genius of 19th century engineering thought. We were deprived not just of history, we were deprived of understanding how our planet works.
We were given primitive physics and a limping history, so that we would never guess that water is not just a liquid, and stone is not just a mineral. What we call the Industrial Revolution was, in fact, a period of looting. We found caches of surviving technologies, found blueprints, and began to copy what we could understand and destroy what we could not. The Suez Canal is a monument to our ignorance and, at the same time, the greatest evidence indicating that we are not the first here. And, apparently, not the smartest.